Hi everyone, we're just going to get straight into today's video. Just for warning that this is quite a heavy video. It's one of the heaviest I've probably done, and it will involve the death of a baby. So if you are not able for watching this, that's completely fine, but thank you as always for your support. So we are going to begin with the couple Frank and Esther McCann. Esther was born in 1956 in Tramore to her mother Bridget and her father Thomas. Sadly, her father would die when she was in her teens. She had two sisters and a brother, and she was the youngest of them. She finished school and sat her leaving cert in 1973 and then went on to UCD to study psychology. So her sister Marion was already living up in Dublin at this point. She was married and had kids, so Esther actually went to live with them. So Esther she was like described as outgoing, and she loved her nieces and nephews and stuff. In fact, Marion would name her daughter after Esther. In 1978, sadly, her boyfriend died in a motorcycle accident. In her second year at college, she decided that psychology wasn't for her. She had an interest in computers, which at the time was like very, very new. So she decided to study this. She would go on then to actually work in Scholl, the foot company, and would work there for 3 years teaching, like, you know, word processing and all this sort of stuff to the employees. She then went on to work for like a firm, like I think it was like an accounting firm or something like that. And again, it would have been doing the computers and teaching other employees the different like programs and stuff. In the mid-80s, she'd been seeing a man named Paul, and he decided he wanted to emigrate to Australia, which is obviously a very popular thing throughout the generations for Irish people. And he wanted Esther to go with him, but she was very much like, I think, like a home bird and didn't want to leave, you know, her family behind. So like she was devastated or whatever, but you know, Paul wanted to go, so he went. Another man that was in their same social circle then like came by, and that was Frank McCann. So Frank McCann was born in 1960, so he was a few years younger than Esther, and his family were from Terranure. His father was Frank and his mother was Joan, and there was 5 siblings in their house. He went to Temple Oak College, and then when he finished, he became a cooper at Guinness. So I'll put like pictures and stuff up of what a cooper is and all. But his father and grandfather were coopers before him, and he actually became the last apprentice cooper to go through Guinness. So there was like an article and all written about him. In 1982, Frank was made redundant from Guinness as cooper. Again, I think it was kind of like a dying craft at the time. He then took like the redundancy money and with another cooper set up Irish Craft Coopers. He then would buy out his partner for £9,000, and I'm not sure if it was after or before that. I think it was after that there was a fire, and it was considered suspicious, but no charges or anything were brought against anybody. He would then go on to sell the business or the premises for £91,000. And in 1991, he opened the Cooperage pub in Blessington. I think he could have done it with one of his brothers. Frank was described as tall, confident, charming. And this is how he won over Esther. So he would, you know, he wooed her, as you would say, in the traditional way. Flowers, chocolates, all of that. So Frank was 26 and Esther was 30. He didn't smoke, he didn't drink. He had been like a professional swimmer, or like a swimmer. He'd like competed in things, and then when he retired from that, he became a coach for, you know, others, younger swimmers and stuff like that. He would have been like on the boards and stuff like this, and then was going to become president of the board for Leinster. The couple bought a house on 39 Butterfield Avenue, which is in Rathfarnham, so it wouldn't actually be that far from his kind of family home. And on the 22nd of May 1987, the couple were married. In August, Frank's son was born. Not Esther and Frank's son. So Frank was a swimming coach, and he began a sexual relationship with a 17-year-old. It is reported that she had additional needs. I'm not sure of any more specifics than that, and I don't really want to speculate, but this girl became pregnant. Now, she was 17, so you could argue that the legal age of consent was, you know, there. But if she had additional needs, that complicates things. Also, the fact that he is her swimming coach, there is a breach of trust there, you know. And Frank was mates, buddies, with other swimming coaches, Gibney and O'Rourke. If you're not familiar with those names, they went on to be accused and charged with different crimes against their like swimmers and stuff. That's something you're interested in, I can cover it on a bigger scale. But they were also then like that put in the power of trust with, you know, for these young swimmers, and they took advantage of it. You can skip back forward for a few seconds if you want, but I remember someone telling me before that I'm not sure if it was a Gibney or O'Rourke, but when they were away, because they would go away to like swimming competitions, so they'd be in hotels and stuff, and that's I think where some of the abuse would have happened. But this swimmer, one of them, I don't know who it was, the man, the coach, came into her hotel room. He pushed her onto the bed and he got on top of her, and she recoiled. So he got up and he left the room, and that was that. And then the next day, he completely ignored her. He wouldn't talk to her. He wouldn't coach her. He wouldn't, you know, kind of give her any type of like favoritism or anything. Just wouldn't kind of engage with her at all, acknowledge her. And that night she went to his room. Predators are not always the man lurking around the corner waiting to pounce. Sometimes they are someone close who knows how to manipulate someone who is in a position lower than him. You know, so someone who is in power knows how to manipulate to get what they want. That was still not her fault, just for clarification. So the girl got pregnant. Her mother confronted Frank, and it was actually Father Michael Cleary, which is another person who then went on to have children and stuff. That's a whole other story. I actually got the woman's book recently, so I haven't started reading it yet. But so she used him as like a liaison, and basically it was agreed that Frank would pay for the hospital bills, and then £500 was like anonymously sent to the teenager's father. So obviously, I mean, it was obviously him. I think that child could have then been put up for adoption. I'm not really sure, but I think so. So back to Frank and Esther. So they are married for 4 years and no children. It says that Esther has like a problem with her thyroid or something, and that she actually cuts back on work. And again, I'm not really sure if this is kind of to help become pregnant or if it's just something she decides to do as well. So at this time then, Frank's 18-year-old sister Jeanette becomes pregnant. And she is unwed, so obviously it's a whole thing like, So I think she's essentially kicked out and goes to live with Frank and Esther. And so she's there for the whole pregnancy. And then on Sunday, the 10th of March, 1991, little Jessica is born. Jeanette had basically said that she would like to give the baby up for adoption, and that she would like Frank and Esther to adopt her daughter. So on the Tuesday, Frank and Esther went to like the social workers in the Cann hospital and made their intentions, you know, that they're clear that they wanted to adopt. And then on Thursday, they all went, like Jeanette went with them again to make it clear that this is what they were all wanting to do. They all went back to the McCann's home, you know, Frank and Esther's house for a little while, and then Jeanette moved out and baby Jessica stayed with them. So Esther, the big, you know, computer genius, decided to start keeping a diary for baby Jessica. But she done it on the computer, and it would obviously be, you know, found later. So she would make little entries. So I'm just going to read one of them. They're all very cute and sweet. Some of them are very basic, and they're just kind of saying, you know, oh, we went to get your, you know, vaccine today, and, you know, then we went over and got the car seat or this and that. But some of them are really cute, and so I'm just going to read one of them. So this is after, you know, Jeanette has moved out and it's just Frank, Esther and Jessica at home. So here you are with us, and we love you dearly. I don't intend to give you a day-by-day account of your life with us, but your early days have been eventful. I will try to fill you in on all the important things that will happen to you in your life, and maybe we can keep a record for you to read when you're older. Frank McCann's family would go swimming on a Friday down in Turner College. At this, they were talking to each other, to other people, I'm not sure, but they were telling how Frank and Esther McCann were adopting Jeanette's baby, Jessica. And the mother of the teenager that Frank had gotten pregnant was there. She was either there or it got back to her. And on the 16th of April, 1991, she phoned the adoption board to object to the adoption, informing them about Frank and her daughter. That summer, Marion, Esther's sister, her son James, who was 16, was diagnosed with bone cancer. So by the 20th of May, they still hadn't heard anything back from the adoption board. They would make general inquiries. In fact, Jeanette, who obviously was her mother, her birth mother, made inquiries and she kind of just got general responses back. Frank had arranged for it to be that, you know, all correspondence would be to him. And so the board actually then confronted him with the information they had been given by the teenager's mother. He denied any knowledge or involvement in any of that. When James was in the hospital, you know, for treatment and stuff, Frank never visited, and in a podcast, Marion would say that this would bother, you know, it would hurt Esther because she was so close to her family, and the fact that he didn't kind of, you know, kind of be there for her maybe. But obviously his mind was, we know now, was preoccupied. But it's also said that 2 years before all this, his dad died, and that Esther had been worried that he didn't show emotion, he didn't grieve, and she had suggested counselling to him and he was having none of that. By the early summer, Frank knew that the application was going to be rejected, meaning that his wife was going to find out about getting the teenager pregnant. Jessica would not be taken from them, essentially. They would still foster her. Really, the adoption in a way was just more of the formality, but like for familial adoptions, it shouldn't take this long, and I think that's why they knew there was something up, because it's normally like that. It's just kind of like things that have to be done, and so, you know, the process is a lot quicker than like a stranger adoption. Jessica was not going to be taken from them, and Marion would say that Esther would have forgiven Frank, you know, that she was that type of person. She would have forgiven him and things would have been okay. The main concern for Frank, he was to become president of the board of Leinster, I was saying. Frank would have been like the kind of high point of contact and stuff, so he would have gotten a lot of like, wah. If this was to come out that he had abused his power and slept with a teenager with additional needs, you know, it's not good, and he would most likely lose his place, especially because what would transpire then with the other two. So it was his reputation that he cared about. That's what this was about, his reputation, losing that. Maybe losing business at the pub. In fact, in the podcast, I think it's Marion who says it, that she believes, or she heard or whatever, that the other lads had advised Frank to get married because less suspicion is on you if you're like a married swimming instructor teaching, you know, young teenage girls, rather than like a single man doing it. And they reckon that this is was that one of the reasons that he wanted to settle down and get married. Now I'll just point out, it's never said, it's said that they had a happy marriage. It's never said that there was any violence or that there was anything wrong. Obviously he was doing what he was doing, but in terms of their actual relationship together, it seemed to be a happy one. I'm just going to read a little bit from my notes just so I get the dates and stuff right. On the 3rd of July 1992, Frank reported a gas leak. The installers, whatever, the technicians come out, they examine, they don't find a leak. On the 16th, he calls them again, and this time they find a Class A leak, and they say that the meter has to be upgraded. So basically this involves two joints being soldered together. On the 26th of July, Frank rings them again to say that that he smells gas. Technicians come out. No, there's no leak. On the 27th of July, James was in hospital at this point. I believe by this stage his prognosis has been, it has been said that it's not good, that he is dying. Esther's sister Phyllis, she's a nun and she actually lives over in England, but she's over visiting, and so she's in Esther's house. And she said Frank is there, but he's kind of in and out of the house constantly. And she said that Esther seemed quite sleepy, like quite, you know, a bit drowsy, like a bit dopey. And like even when she's leaving, Esther's just kind of getting go straight up to bed, kind of know like goodbye, you know, like just early the following morning. Esther woke and she had a headache, and so it took her a few minutes to realize like that the smell she was getting was gas. And I tell you, she was better than me because I don't think I would have realised what to do. So she just ran into Jessica's room, grabbed her straight out the door. She put Jessica into the car. She took the handbrake off the car. She did not start it. And then she like pushed the car down onto the road or whatever, got in, let the car roll. And when she was far enough away, she found Frank and they obviously found the gas and stuff. I, like, to be honest, I didn't realise that. So like obviously I know if you turn a switch on, that could cause like an explosion. But I didn't know like the car outside could. So hopefully there's something we all learned. So at 7:55 a.m, the gas technicians had been back out and they said, yeah, there was a leak. So basically, remember the two soldered joints that I had said about? They had come apart, and it was said like the only way for them to come apart was for heat to have been applied to get them to pull apart. I'm not sure where Frank was that early in the morning, where he should have been. Then on the 11th of August, Esther is woken by the phone ringing. And as she wakes, she realises that the electric blanket on the end of the bed is on fire. So she gets up, she puts it out or whatever she does, and then she answers the phone. And the phone is actually the Gardaí in Blessington asking is Frank there because the alarm is going off in the pub. The electric blanket had last been in the spare room. Remember, it's August, you're not using an electric blanket. Even in Ireland, you're not using an electric blanket in August. Now, so where's Frank? So if he wasn't there and he wasn't at the pub because the alarm was going off, where was he? There's also a report about Esther's brakes failing at some point. Now, all of this is going on, and essentially, Frank is, excuse the like pun, gaslighting Esther. He's basically saying to her, like, you need to be more careful, this and that. At one point, he even says that he's gonna like sue the, you know, Bord Gosh. But he's basically making it seem like, no, like, you must have put the electric blanket there, and all these things, you need to be more careful, make sure you're like that, make sure you're not, you know, leaving the gas on or things like this. So in August, Esther actually goes to the doctor now because she's like a shell of herself. On the 13th of August, Frank McCann rings Rathfarnham Garda Station and says that he is getting threatening calls to the house. He would then later ring Blessington Garda Station and say that he was getting threatening calls to the pub. Another pub, the West Wicklow House, their owner, Tim Grace, he also got a call then where apparently it said like, pay up or you'll be burnt out or something like that. And he didn't really pay attention to it at the time, obviously. And then when things transpire, that's obviously when he comes forward to the Gardaí to tell them that this happened. On the 31st of August, Frank then brings like the Gardaí to the pub to show them that like it's been written or painted on the wall, the back wall of the pub, like, burn you bastard. At one point, he then rings the guards to say that in the phone book under his pub, like where his pub thing is, it says like burn or whatever, right? Now, first, I kind of just find out, why are you looking up in the phone book your own page? You know, you'd know the number. You know, like, why are you looking it up in the phone book? So I don't even know why you'd be looking for you to have found this. So the end of August, start of September, Esther at this point has just become fed up with the adoption delay. So she had obviously let Frank, you know, take the lead with it and stuff like that. But at this point, she was just fed up. So she rings the Coombe and she basically like wants to retrace the steps that they took to the application to see what happened, what's gone wrong. And so she actually makes an appointment for the 7th of September to go into the Coombe to speak to them. So on the 3rd of September, 1992, Marion has gone down to Tramore. Obviously, that was their family home with her kids. And Esther was kind of on two minds of whether to go down with her. But she decided not to because she said like, no, I'm going to stay. And she said, I'm going to have it out with Frank tonight. Like, I'm going to just find out what's going on with the adoption. That day, it's also reported that the gas was again checked and it was fine. So at 8:30, baby Jessica was in bed. So at this stage, baby Jessica is 18 months. She has, you know, she's walking, she's saying things like mommy, daddy, she's saying these little bits, and they just think she's wonderful. In fact, I'm going to read the last entry that Esther made in her diary, and this was on the 30th of July. My darling daughter Jessica, you have grown and become a beautiful child. You have been walking now for a little over a week and have given up holding on to the walls in search of your one bit of independence. Cup of tea and up a daisy with constant talk of daddy, oh mammy and mammy's baby. Lots of talk, and every day brings new joys of every sort in sight, sound, speech and movement. 10 teeth to show for all the months of painful teething which gave you some problems with infections of all sorts. Nana's little darling in everything you do. She never ceases to love looking at you, and you can really amuse with your antics, including playing the piano with much style and seriousness. May Warner next door will have to take you for lessons soon. So at 8:30 p.m, baby Jessica is asleep in her cot. Esther was doing like a private lesson for, the computers or word processing, whatever, with a woman, and that woman left shortly before 10. Around this time, Frank came home, so he took like an hour break from the pub and would come home. And it is said that he, sat down for tea, probably some food, and they watched TV, him and Esther. It's also said that he noticed a mark on the back door and reported this to the Gardaí. At around 11 o'clock then, he went back to the pub. At 12:30 a.m, he went into the chipper, which was beside the pub, and got chips and stayed there for about 10 minutes while he was waiting for them. At 1 a.m, the barman left, and he would recall that Frank then had probably half an hour left of work to do. But the owner of the chipper would say that around this time as well, he heard the gate to the pub close, and so assumed it was Frank. At some point between 1:35 to 1:45 a.m, a neighbour heard 2 loud bangs and then a car speeding off. Another neighbour said that they saw the front door of Esther and Frank's house ajar with flames bursting through it. Neighbours gathered on the lawn. One even tried to, bring a ladder and put it over by the window, but the flames were so strong, no one would have been able to try go in. And at 1:50 a.m, the fire brigade arrived. Within minutes, Frank arrived on the scene. He seemed distraught. He was screaming, saying, "No, my wife and baby are in there," and he appeared to try go towards the house to get in, and obviously people held him back. So Esther was found on the landing, and it said in one of the books that she could have easily tried to escape through the window of her bedroom, but she was obviously trying to get to Jessica. And at this point, obviously on the landing, maybe the fumes became too much and she went unconscious. So she would die by inhalation of carbon monoxide, and she also had extensive burns to her body. Baby Jessica had the same cause of death of inhalation by carbon monoxide, and when she was found, she still had her soother in her mouth. It's never reported that Esther wanted nothing more than to be a mother or anything like that. It's not really, but it is said that she was very loving, and even like that with her nieces and nephews and stuff. And I feel like she just, from reading the little diary entries, it just feels like she was so happy to now become a mother, but also like that to have this beautiful little baby that just brought so much joy into their lives. But even in her last act of life, she still tried to protect her daughter. Marion, who was down in Tremor, woke hearing her mother-in-law crying. So her husband hadn't gone out with them, so when he found out, he rang and told his mother, and then put Marion on, and Marion was told. Marion says she doesn't really remember, other than kind of hugging her children and telling them. She says she doesn't really remember a lot more after that for a few hours, but that she was told that she kept saying he did it. At 3:15 a.m, Bord Gáis had carried out an examination, and they determined that there was no leak. Detective Inspector Tony Surk and Superintendent Pat King had attended the scene. So they returned back to Talagard Station at 7:30 a.m. and immediately the fire was considered suspicious. A blowtorch and a gas canister had been found in the hallway, but they didn't have a suspect. Later that day, the barman who worked there said he got a call, and it basically said did the main man hear the bad news yet? He would say that he thought it sounded like someone was trying to disguise their voice. Frank McCann obviously couldn't go home, so he then went to live with a friend of Esther, Emer Farrell. The funeral of Esther and Jessica took place in Mount Carmel in Fairhouse, and Marion's family basically wanted her to be buried in Tramore, you know, like with her father. And McCann didn't like object to this or anything, he agreed. So Esther and Jessica were in the same coffin, and so they left Dublin to go down to the Holy Cross Church and Cemetery in Tramore. The church was packed. Phyllis arranged, you know, everything. Frank insisted that there was to be no black war, that, you know, it was, you know, people were to wear joyous colours. Frank had to be helped up the aisle by Phyllis. It was kind of like he said for the eulogy, he wasn't sure if he was going to do a eulogy or not. And so then when he did do one, he basically said in it at one point in the podcast, Marion says, like, he says, oh, and then on to the other man in Esther's life. And then kind of like paused for a second before he then said, like, about her godson. You know, so kind of, for obviously people would have been a bit like, wait, what? You know, like trying to kind of imply something, you know, I don't know, like just taint that last little bit of her or something, I don't know. But a lot of stuff would kind of come out then after this strange behaviour for Frank. So apparently, like when they were, like when the family, the funeral car was going through Tramore. I don't know if it was at, sorry, I know I'm saying Tramore wrong. What? Tramore? I feel like I'm saying it wrong. But he was like hanging out the window of the funeral car and like shouting to like schoolgirls and being like, oh, I'm a free man, ladies, and stuff like this, like saying really bizarre stuff. After the funeral, he actually went back up to Dublin and held a surprise 60th in his pub for his mum. And like Esther's family only found this out afterwards because of people who had attended, who then felt really guilty and told them, like, felt like, oh, you know, because they had been invited, but it felt really weird and disrespectful to be there. Marion had to go out to Frank's car at some point, and when she opened the boot to get whatever she needed to get, his chain of office from like the presidency or whatever, from the swimming, was in the boot. And she said, like, that was in the hall. It was like, it must have been like kind of on show in the hall in their house. And like, that was it. It solidified for her, like, he done it, like, and that he didn't want it to be ruined. He didn't want to risk it getting ruined, so he took it with him before. Her son Thomas would say that I think they stopped on the way down to Tramore to get food, you know, and he said that he looked out and he could see Frank like kind of walking around the hearse and stuff, and he was talking to himself and then talking to the car, like to the coffin. The undertaker would then contact Marion, obviously a while later or whatever, to say like Frank hadn't paid the bill or whatever. And so obviously it was real embarrassing and all. So then Marion and her husband just paid it to just solve the matter. The Guardian didn't actually speak to Frank until Saturday the 6th of September, so a couple of days later, and talked to him, obviously gave a statement and said, you know, he had come home and went back, and he talked about the mark that he had found and reported to the guards. He sketched the mark out. I don't really know what mark, like a footprint, like a boot print or something, I don't know. And he told him that he locked up at 1:30 a.m. and had arrived on the scene, obviously then kind of at like 1:45 or 10 or whatever. Up until this point, like, they were talking to him, like, they were only talking to him like as a witness, you know, and as a family member. But then when Bord Gosh got in touch with him to say about the different reports of a gas leak, that there had been none, but then like that time that was the bad gas leak, had been because someone had tampered with it basically, and that's how it became loose. Frank was then brought into, quote, the orbit of suspicion. Then Tim Grace from the other pub, he got in touch to say, oh, you know, yeah, someone had threatened me saying they were going to burn the pub down or whatever. The adoption board, so someone from the adoption board saw, you know, about the fire in the newspaper, and obviously they knew that Frank had been told it was going to be rejected. They said that they thought everybody in all involved parties needed to know, and they had given his solicitor, I think, a month to kind of come back to them, and then this had happened. So he came forward, or this worker, came forward and told the Gardaí all of this, that, you know, that the application had been refused and it was because of his involvement with a teenager. Marion had also voiced a suspicion that she believed it was him. Obviously, all these bits, then he was just becoming more suspicious until he was the prime suspect. So the motive started to become clear, you know, like that, because of he was going to lose his reputation or whatever. And obviously then all the failed attempts showed planning. On the 18th of September, remember I said Frank was staying with a friend, Emer. And so like a mass card came through the letterbox in the post, and it said like to Reverend Byrne or whatever. And so obviously this was kind of like another threatening thing. And then other like unstamped envelopes came through, you know, with other stuff in it. So obviously it was kind of like, oh, they knew where you were, kind of thing. Frank McCann basically knew that he was in the eyes of the Gardaí, and so he became really paranoid, and he would constantly be around asking everyone that the Gardaí had spoken to, like, what did they ask you, what were they saying, what were they thinking, all of this stuff. And Marion said like that he practically wouldn't leave there. It's like he was constantly there, and that became very uneasy because she knew that he was responsible. And like she was already dealing with her son, like her son James is dying, and they just want to spend their last time together, you know, just as a family or whatever, and that Frank won't leave them alone. And she just said as the days went on, she just became more and more uneasy with this. So for the investigation, they set up checkpoints. There was house-to-house inquiries. Over 200 people were interviewed. And then they were actually doing experiments. You know how they found like the gas canister and the blowtorch? So they were actually trying to do different experiments to see what could have caused the fire, you know, so that they knew the method and stuff like that. Frank McCann then invited Sergeant Patsy Glennon around to like talk about the case, and like kept him there for like 4 hours to talk about everything. At the end of October, Marion and James travelled to Canada. Her brother lived over there, and so, you know, they wanted to say goodbye. And then the rest of her family, I think, went out to Tremor, just so again they stayed away from Frank's, you know, so he couldn't be at them and stuff. On the 4th of November then, the experiments, one of them then was proved to be like, this is how the fire would have been caused. And so Frank McCann was arrested at the Cooperage. He was brought to Talagard station. Now, typically for something like this, for murder or whatever, you would be arrested under the Criminal Justice Act. And this allowed 12 hours detention for questioning. But the Offences Against the State Act allowed 48 hours. And so Frank McCann was arrested under the Offences Against the State Act. But this was because of the nature of the fire, including the report of 2 loud bangs, suggested that an incident had taken place that contravened the explosive acts, which qualifies for the Offences Against the State Act. And then because like the calls, so like the calls to the West Wicklow bar that said like, pay or you'll be burnt out or whatever, they basically said that that had like an alleged subversive element with references to the IRA. So again, that would have been an offence against the State Act. So they were able to keep him for 48 hours. It says that 2 of his brothers were present during this time. I don't know if they were there for all of it or just kind of near the end. I'm just going to read another little bit. So basically, Frank admitted that he started the fire. It says like it's like he was incoherent. So he basically says like he broached a problem with the adoption board, stating, I was going to finish it all. I was going to clear up the whole mess, me, Esther and Jessica. I need to get away, but I can't go from everything. I can't leave them. I can't leave without them. It says like that he always spoke in like a present tense when talking about what had happened. He said he had a can of petrol and it fell over, and all he remembered was a lighted match and flames everywhere. Came to like the end of the 48 hours, and so he hadn't actually admitted it yet or whatever, hadn't said all this. And so he got up, he left, and he walked back involuntarily and sat down, and then continued telling them all this. So, you know, it was basically like he wasn't under arrest, right? He wasn't under detention, and he just volunteered this information. When he left here, he then went and booked himself into St. John of God's and said that he had had a nervous breakdown. At this point, the DPP told the Gardaí to keep investigating. Frank, the old charmer, remember? He met a woman in the hospital, and when he got out just before Christmas, he moved down to Waterford, because that's where she was from. She was from Stradbally, so he moved down there, which is not far from Tremor. And so Frank didn't keep like a low profile or anything. He was seen out with this woman and stuff down there. On the 5th of April, 1993, James lost his battle with cancer. In his last hours, he asked, you know, would Frank ever pay for what he did to Esther and Jessica? and his uncle lied and told him that he had already been arrested. But I suppose this was foretelling, because on the 22nd, down in Waterford, Frank McCann was arrested, and he attended a special sitting of the Waterford District Court. His bail application was rejected because his new girl had connections to Canada. Frank would appeal this all the way to the Supreme Court, and it would be denied. The trial would begin on the 11th of January 1994. Things were going as they were, and on the 31st, when it came to where they would have discussed Frank McCann's statement, in his cell, Frank tried to set himself on fire with a can of deodorant and a lighter. The jury was discharged. Several new dates for a trial would keep getting postponed, basically, because his defense kept saying, you know, like, because of the state of his health or his mental health, whatever. So finally, on the 10th of June 1996, so years later, the trial began again. This jury had 6 men and 6 women. Frank's 3 brothers testified against him. At one point, the jury were excused for like a good lot of time while they decided whether Frank McCann's admission was allowed to be read, and then it was allowed. On August the 1st, so like it's a long trial, Frank McCann decided to testify. Now, this is quite unusual, where the books are saying. The book by Michael Clifford, Love You to Death, which is where I've been quoting some of the stuff from. So he basically says how like it's quite unusual for in a murder trial for the defendant, the accused, to testify, because the onus is on the prosecution to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he'd done it. It's not up to the defence to prove they didn't do it. And so by testifying, you're opening yourself up to being cross-examined and stuff like this, so it's more likely for you to be tripped up and give them something. And so he actually says like that this would be kind of like the sign of like not a good counsel, like inexperienced counsel or whatever. But it's interesting because one of his solicitors for the defence is Barry White. If you don't know that name, that's fine. If you only know him as a singer, it's okay. But Barry White would go on to become Justice Barry White. So he gets up and nearly immediately he starts hyperventilating, and it is decided that he is not fit to continue. So the trial is like postponed again till the following week, the 6th. So it's been a few days. So then he starts to say like that there was mistreatment in the Garda station, you know, that he had been slapped around the head with photos of Jessica and Esther's bodies, you know, photos of their bodies and stuff after the fire. He also said that like when he had been arrested in the pub, that like they called him like a murdering bastard and stuff like this. Now apparently no one who was present in the pub came forward to like agree with this or anything. He said that he had already told Esther about the application being rejected, and he said he had never accepted the paternity of the other baby. And then the defence, in their closing speech, Justice Barry White, said that people grieve differently when it came to, you know, like the fact that they had the party after the funeral, all these type of things. And I agree with that to some extent. You know, people do, you know, I don't think anybody, unless you're in that position, can say how someone is going to grieve. I do agree with that. And he says about the fact that he had been there for 48 hours, essentially, you know, being questioned or whatever. Now, bear in mind, for those 48 hours, they're not allowed to question you for 48 hours. Every so often, and how many hours it is, they have to give you breaks. They have to give you breaks to eat. They have to give you breaks to sleep and stuff like that. So, you know, it wasn't like they sat him there for 48 hours and made him stay awake. The prosecution's closing statement was easy, simple, and to the point. He had the means, the motive, and the history of failed attempts. Judge Paul Carney addressed the jury of 6 men and 6 women for 5 hours just to go through everything with them, you know, of what they were to do and what they could find him guilty of and all this. So at 6:15 p.m. on the 14th of August, they went to deliberate. So again, like the trial started on the 10th of June and we're now on the 14th of August. Like it was a long trial. Then at 8 p.m. they were called back and the judge basically said like, no, he's going to wait till tomorrow to continue. So the next day they continued till 6:15 p.m. And at this point, the judge said that they were allowed to have a majority verdict of 11-1 or 10-2. And then only 30 minutes later, they came back and it was a unanimous verdict that he was found guilty for the murder of Esther McCann and Jessica. The trial had lasted 48 days. Esther's family cried and hugged in the courtroom. Jeanette also sat crying, like how she must have felt, you know, thinking that she was giving her little baby to her brother to, you know, protect, care, love, look after, and then for him to just do the opposite. He was sentenced to life, which is mandatory, and then he appealed it, and in April 1997 this was rejected. In April 1998, Esther's mother Bridget basically took a court case, and I've talked about it, I think, in Celine Cawley's murder, but obviously at this time it was quite rare. So basically she didn't want Frank to get any like assets or, you know, profit from the death of Esther. So when the house was sold, half of the house profits, the sale, went to Bridget, just as part of like the Civil Liability Act. Bridget would actually die then in 2003. Now, the 90s, sadly, were a good while away. Not that I like to admit it, but they were. And so I'm just going to give you a bit of information. I'm going to read it, just keep you up to date with what Frank was up to. At the time of the fire, there were reports that Frank McCann was having another sexual relationship with a 16-year-old. In 2009, he completed a computer science degree. Isn't it funny? Because like that was Esther's thing. Like, I don't know if he ever showed interest in all that stuff before, but like computers were Esther's thing. Say I'm being silly or petty, I don't care. In May 2012, he was allowed out of prison to attend Ballyfermot training course. So he would go out for the day and then just come back at night. In July 2017, he basically was allowed, he was in Arbor Hill, and he was allowed to like clean the prison officers' quarters. So to get there, I think they had to like actually come out onto the street. So, you know, he was just out. He wasn't handcuffed, any of this, and was just walking along with a prison officer. In May 2019, he done another computer course. And in July of that year, he was seen like out gardening in the grounds of the prison, but like literally just by the railings. Like if you were walking by, you could be like, hey Frank, you know, like just like essentially just out in the public with people. Now, I know he's behind bars, like, but still. In January 2022, Frank McCann basically threw a strop. He threw a strop and like quit his job and stuff after a documentary had been done on this case called the case I can't remember, where Marion and her daughter Esther, who obviously now is grown up, were talking in it. So he was getting like taunts and stuff from the other prisoners, and so obviously he didn't like when things like this came up. In March 2021, his sister-in-law and his brother Bernard basically talked about how they were fearful for him to come out. His brother actually even said like that he had a devious nature. He didn't like being the centre of attention or anything, and so he wouldn't leave the cell because they kept like all the other cellmates and stuff were like kept asking him questions and stuff like this, so he wouldn't come out. It's also said that he worked in the library with Malcolm McCarter, who I mentioned in my very first case. If you haven't watched it, go watch it. And I will cover his case eventually, but yes, apparently he was like, oh, because he's so notorious. There was also talk about like he had a LinkedIn profile. I tried to find it and I couldn't. So I'm not really sure. If you can find it, let me know. Let me know, link there. And then in January 23, just gone, because it has now been 30 years since this all happened, Esther's family were again saying like that they are fearful for him to get out because of what he has done, and they don't, like, he hasn't shown remorse. He hasn't engaged in any rehabilitation services, but unfortunately, like 30 years is already considered an extremely long life sentence, and he was sentenced to, like, for double murder, so it would have been 2 life sentences, let's say. But again, here, like, you're talking like that's 15 for each, which is on the lower end of average now, I suppose. But I don't think it's going to take long before he comes out. Like, he already gets like dawn till dusk release, so he's allowed out and stuff. So I think it's inevitable that he's going to be coming out soon. He's described as a model prisoner, but again, as I said, never shows remorse or anything like that. And like that, even obviously when he was, like, after a certain amount of years, you're allowed to apply for release, like early release parole and stuff. And like, he never shows emotion or anything when he's at any of these court sittings. I'm going to just leave the case of Esther and Jessica on a quote from Marion. I like to think of Esther before she met McCann. For a lot of people, she was a ray of sunshine in their lives, very loving, very kind. We grew up in a small town by the sea where everything was local and friendly. She was just a very trusting person. When the problem with the adoption arose, all McCann would have had to do was tell her. She would have forgiven him. She didn't have a malicious bone in her body. We all took him in, made him one of the family. I knew what sugar he'd take in his tea, what vegetables he liked. I always made pavlova for him because I knew how much he liked it. He was that close to all of us and we didn't even know him.